Imagine waking up on an ordinary morning and discovering that within a few hours, entire cities could disappear from the map. Not because of an invasion, not because an army was crossing a border, but because two superpowers had decided to push a few buttons. For decades, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a rivalry that seemed impossible to end. They had opposing ideologies, enormous nuclear arsenals, and allies scattered across virtually every corner of the planet. And although American and Soviet soldiers rarely fought each other directly, the entire world knew that a war between the two could mean something far worse. It could mean the end of civilization as the world knew. This was the Cold War, but there is one part of this story that is often forgotten. At certain moments, humanity wasn't simply facing the distant threat of nuclear war. It was only a few steps away from it. And the most frightening part is that, on some occasions, perhaps all it took to prevent catastrophe was a single person's decision. To understand how this was possible, we need to go back to the period immediately following World War II. In 1945, the world was still devastated by the largest conflict in history. Millions of people had died, cities lay in ruins, and Europe was struggling to rebuild what remained. But as Germany was defeated, a new rivalry was beginning to emerge. On one side stood the United States, the leading economic and military power of the Western world. On the other stood the Soviet Union, which had suffered enormous losses during the war and now controlled much of Eastern Europe. The old alliance against Hitler quickly disappeared, and in its place emerged a question that would haunt governments for decades. Who would control the future of the world? The Americans feared the spread of communism. The Soviets feared being surrounded by Western powers, and both sides began building arsenals capable of destroying the planet. First came atomic bombs, then came even more powerful weapons, and eventually a terrifying logic emerged. If one side attacked first, the other would have enough power to retaliate and destroy the aggressor. It became known as the balance of terror. It seemed absurd, but it worked. As long as no one pushed the button, everyone survived. The problem was that this system depended on something extremely fragile: human beings making perfect decisions while facing extreme fear. And that was exactly where the Cold War became so dangerous, because governments could make mistakes, computers could misinterpret signals, military commanders could believe they were under attack. And in the middle of all that tension, a single piece of incorrect information could trigger a chain of events that would become impossible to stop. But the world had not yet reached its most dangerous moment. That would happen years later, when the United States discovered something that would completely change the game. Soviet nuclear missiles were being installed just a few miles from American territory. And at that moment, the clock began to run. The news reached Washington as a threat that could not be ignored. In October 1962, American spy planes photographed Soviet installations in Cuba. The images revealed something that would completely transform the situation. The Soviet Union was installing nuclear missiles capable of striking much of the United States. For President John F. Kennedy, this presented an almost impossible situation. If he allowed the missiles to remain in Cuba, it would appear that the United States had accepted a dangerous shift in the balance of power. But if he ordered an attack, he could provoke a Soviet response. Kennedy gathered his top advisors and began discussing the available options. Some argued for an immediate airstrike against the Soviet installations. Others wanted an invasion of Cuba. Instead, Kennedy chose a different approach: a naval quarantine around Cuba, preventing additional Soviet military shipments from reaching the island. During those days, millions of people followed the news without knowing whether they were witnessing a diplomatic negotiation or the opening chapters of a nuclear war. And then came one of the most frightening questions of the entire crisis. What would happen if a Soviet ship simply kept moving forward? If the Americans fired on it, the Soviet Union could retaliate against American forces somewhere else, and one reaction could trigger another. Meanwhile, Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev exchanged messages, desperately trying to find a way out. The problem was that neither leader could afford to appear weak. Kennedy needed to convince Moscow to remove the missiles. Khrushchev needed to avoid a public humiliation. And while the leaders negotiated, military forces on both sides remained at the highest levels of alert. But there was an even more frightening detail. The United States knew that Soviet nuclear weapons were in Cuba. What Washington did not fully understand was what would happen if an invasion actually began. Soviet forces were stationed on the island and prepared to resist, and some of those forces possessed tactical nuclear weapons. That meant an American invasion could trigger a situation that no military plan could fully control. Imagine the scene: American soldiers landing in Cuba, Soviet troops attempting to stop their advance, commanders receiving conflicting orders, and nuclear weapons waiting for a decision. The world was dangerously close to turning a political crisis into an actual war. Then, when it seemed the situation could not become any more dangerous, an American aircraft was shot down over Cuba. The pilot was killed. In Washington, tensions exploded. Now Kennedy had to decide whether to respond militarily. Single order could put the two superpowers on a collision course. But the crisis still had one final moment of tension, because while the leaders were trying to prevent war, another confrontation was unfolding far from the cameras, involving men who had only minutes to decide whether the world would survive. And that story would prove that sometimes the difference between peace and destruction can depend on a single person. The tension did not end with the Cuban Missile Crisis. In fact, the episode revealed something even more dangerous. Even when leaders were trying to prevent war, military events could completely escape political control. While Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated, Soviet submarines were secretly moving through the Atlantic. Some carried nuclear torpedoes. One of them, the B-59, was surrounded by American ships dropping depth charges to force it to surface. Inside the submarine, the situation was desperate. The crew had been submerged for hours. Communication was limited, and temperatures inside were becoming unbearable. The men did not know whether the war had already begun. Then they began hearing explosions. To the Americans, those depth charges were warning signals. To the Soviets inside the submarine, however, they could have meant that they were under attack. Commander Valentin Savitsky believed that war might have already started, and there was a terrifying detail. The submarine was carrying a nuclear torpedo. According to later accounts, Savitsky even considered launching the weapon, but there was a crucial Soviet rule. The launch required the agreement of 3 officers. 2 were prepared to authorize the action. The third was Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov refused. That decision may have been one of the most important in the entire Cold War, because if that torpedo had been launched against an American ship, the response could have been devastating, and this would not be the last time. In the years that followed, the United States and the Soviet Union continued stockpiling weapons, improving missiles, and creating increasingly sophisticated warning systems. The faster the missiles became, the less time leaders had to make decisions. An attack could be detected, and in some scenarios, a response would have to be launched within minutes. This created a terrifying paradox. The systems designed to prevent war could also trigger one. All it took was a mistake. And in that environment, no one had to actually want a war to end up starting one. One of the greatest examples came in 1983. That year, Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov was working at a nuclear early warning center when the system reported that 5 American missiles had been launched toward the Soviet Union. Petrov was suspicious. 5 missiles seemed too few to represent a full-scale American attack. He decided to treat the warning as a false alarm. Minutes later, it became clear that he had been right. The system had malfunctioned. There were no American missiles. The danger had come from the warning system itself, but there was still one final detail. The Cold War came close to disaster not only because of missiles or submarines. It came close because human beings, machines, and imperfect information were trapped inside a system in which a single mistake could cost millions of lives. And then came the moment when that system would be pushed to its limits, and the clock continued ticking silently above them. In November 1983, the danger began to rise again. The Soviet Union was becoming increasingly suspicious that the United States might be preparing a surprise attack. Washington was conducting military exercises, simulating nuclear war. To the Americans, it was training. To some Soviet officials, it could look like preparations for a real attack. It was in this environment that Exercise Able Archer 83 took place. For several days, NATO forces conducted a highly realistic military exercise involving communications, troop movements, and procedures designed to simulate a nuclear war. The problem was that the Soviets did not know for certain that it was only an exercise. And here was the real danger. If Moscow believed Washington was preparing to attack, it might decide to launch its own weapons first. A war could begin, not because anyone wanted to destroy the enemy, but because someone believed they were about to be destroyed. It sounds absurd, but that was exactly what made the Cold War so dangerous. For decades, the world was trapped in a balance of fear. Each side knew that an attack could trigger a devastating response, and despite all those moments of tension, World War III never happened. But why? The answer lies not only with presidents, generals, or weapons. It also lies with the men who, at critical moments, decided to question what the systems were telling them. Vasily Arkhipov did not launch the torpedo. Stanislav Petrov did not confirm the false attack. Kennedy and Khrushchev, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, stepped back when they realized that moving forward could lead to a point of no return. Those decisions may seem small compared with the enormous nuclear arsenals surrounding them, but it was precisely those small decisions that prevented enormous consequences. That is the greatest lesson of the Cold War. The world did not survive because the danger was smaller than we imagined. It survived because, time and time again, someone chose to stop. In the end, the Cold War ended without a direct battle between the two superpowers. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the rivalry lost its primary opponent. But nuclear weapons did not disappear, and neither did the possibility of nuclear war. The history of the Cold War reveals something deeply unsettling. Entire systems can depend on human decisions made within minutes. Misinterpretation, a faulty radar, a misunderstood order, a frightened commander, any one of them could have changed history. Perhaps the most frightening question is not why the Cold War almost triggered World War. Perhaps it is how many times we came close without even realizing it, because when we look back, we discover that humanity did not stand before a single abyss. It stood before several, and every time someone chose not to take the next step, the world continued to exist. If you enjoy real stories that reveal humanity's most dangerous moments, subscribe to the channel, because some of the most frightening stories are the ones where everything almost happened.